Well, thank you very much for not stampeding out of the room. It's sort of one thing to stand between people and dinner, and another thing to stand between people and a party. So I'm going to try to make 5 points, and one will hopefully deepen your appreciation for the movie, which I was up at the top there, and I just got a really rollicking sense of how people really, really enjoyed the movie, and I'm very happy about that. And then because the whole theme of this is ReFrame, I'd like to give you a sense of how we could reframe the way they think about food waste issues, or what they call food waste issues. And then I just thought that the opportunity of being here in Peterborough, which is a sort of very human-scaled community with a lot of people who are very socially and environmentally aware, it would be almost criminal not to end with what people can do as individuals, as a community, and as a city to really turn this around. So that's how I'd like to go. So the interesting thing, as someone who's been involved in food issues for about 20 years, is that the food waste issue, or what's called the food waste issue, and I hope after tonight you won't call it the food waste issue, has basically gone from 0 to 60 in 1 year. So when I started in the 1990s, the big issues were world hunger, toxics and pesticides in agriculture, and the disappearance of farmers of the middle as a result of free trade around the world, or so-called free trade. And then the next decade, the issue was world poverty, world obesity, and the disappearance of farmers in the middle as a result of free trade, and the disappearance of workers of the middle as a result of free trade. And so there was just no way to get food waste onto the agenda, which for some peculiar reason in my own biography was always a central issue for me, because when I went to university, I worked my way through university working in the garbage department in the summer, so I saw everything in this movie when I was 18 years old. So, but the issue went from 0 to 60 in a very short period of time, and this movie is part of it. And I think it's an incredible achievement, because that movie held your attention for over an hour, and it kept you happy for over an hour talking about a totally yucky topic. And just think about other issues and think how rare that is. Like, no one has been able to do that about world hunger. Nobody's been able to do it about the 1%, or about all the resources that are spent on war. This is a very rare achievement. And I think we want to understand what makes it work. And as I see it, it's because they understand 2 secrets of communication. And one of them is that instead of telling you something, they show you something, where they themselves are learners, and they're not the teachers speaking down to you, but are poking fun at themselves as they go through it. And second, that they put those shows in the context of a story that has some drama, like, are we going to make it? I want to get out of here, and the like. In other words, those are the 2 keys to human communication, I believe, universally. And I believe that the environmental and social change movements have lost sight of that, because basically in elementary school, high school, college, university, and public health training or whatever, what you learn is this method of communicating. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you. Okay, and so having a story and showing people rather than telling them, I believe, is a new challenge for us. And I hope if any of you have the opportunity to be teachers or advocates in this field, that you will follow the example that they've set in this movie. My second point has to do with the way they frame food policy issues, and I have sort of 3 separate points about that. And the sort of tip-off of it is that they refer always to food waste. And I believe it's important when talking about waste to understand that waste is a verb, not a noun. There is no waste in nature. It is humans who create waste. And so it's odd that that term, food waste, has slipped into our vocabulary. And for people who have read my book on the no-nonsense guide, know I make a big deal about the fact that we should not use the word food problem, because in my opinion, we have no food problems. We only have human problems that are created around food. And to call it a food problem is to put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. And I think what that does is it misses the fundamental point about food and what makes food such an exciting issue to work on. If I tried to discourage you from driving your Hummer into town here to see the film tonight, and instead take a smaller car, like a smart car, we could reduce the environmental damage that you would do. And if I could convince you not to take a small smart car, but an electric scooter, we would reduce it again. And if I could encourage you to bicycle instead of taking an electric scooter, we would reduce it yet again. And if you walked instead of bicycling, you would reduce it again almost to zero. But that is as good as it gets in the field of transportation. And it's the same with buildings and with clothing and any other human activity. You can get from doing a lot of harm to a little bit of harm. But what makes food different is you can go from making a heck of a lot of harm down to no harm, but you can also move from doing no good to a heck of a lot of good. That is, you can move right across the entire spectrum. And food is the only area of human activity that allows us to do that. So let me give you an example on both ends. If you saw all that food going into landfill, what happens is that it rots without any access to oxygen, and so it gives off methane. And methane is approximately 20 times worse than carbon dioxide in terms of its impact on global warming. And the moisture that's in that food eventually seeps down into the water table and gets out into lakes, rivers, oceans, and the like, with all the toxics that it's picked up on the way down. So what happens on the bad side is very, very bad. But if we want to take a look at the other side of the ledger, this is January, and so people are still putting out their Christmas trees, and in some communities, they take the Christmas trees to a nearby goat farm, and the goats eat the Christmas trees and keeps them going through January. In other words, we're producing protein, a high-quality protein out of waste. And if we then charred the rest, what remained of the tree, and then on another setting, we took all the food scraps, put them indoors and composted them. When they are composting, they give off heat. And so as is done in Milwaukee, they use the compost to heat greenhouses during the winter, getting rid of the major energy problem and pollution problem associated with greenhouses. And if you let insects grow in the compost and enjoy it, you can then let chickens loose among it, and you can then pick up others and throw them to your aquaponic section, and again produce protein. And so you can have food waste, which is creating new protein out of, in essence, nothing, out of a wasted product, and you have compost at the end of the day that goes into soil, enriched with the carbon from our Christmas trees, which will be stored for hundreds upon hundreds of years underground and keeping that carbon out of the atmosphere. So that is the spectrum that we can go with food, from 20 times worse than carbon dioxide to actual improvement of the situation in terms of what we're able to store underground. And the soil, by the way, stores more carbon underground than all the trees on the planet, approximately 3 times more. So whatever we can do to enrich the soil is very powerful. So I think, in other words, when we talk about, we don't want to use the word food waste, we want to use the word wasted food, and we don't want to talk about the waste problem, but we want to talk about the waste opportunity. And that's the conversation changers that we need to introduce. My third point, the second point about food system, is that we actually need to see it as a food system issue. I would say they have a relatively limited view of how long the food system is and how wide it is in this movie. And that is, it sort of goes from the fields where you're lobbing off the ends and the sides of celery to the landfill site. But it starts a lot earlier and it goes a lot later. And I think we need to deal with the fact that food waste is not just something that happens at one stage in the food system, but permeates the entire system from beginning to end. It is fundamentally a system to manufacture scarcity by manufacturing waste. And so I think partially, if I might be a little err on the direction of nationalism, because probably the terms of the film required that they have a US commentators on waste rather than Canadian commentators. In the United States, it's always considered, if you had food that you're going to waste anyway, you should give it to poor people. So that's sort of one bias of the movie. And they take that thing, which is actually right from the USDA, that here's the pyramid of what you do with unused food, and the first use is humans, which is not, in my opinion, at all sync with any sense of dignity of people on low income and how the kind of setting that you want to provide for people who are having a tough time in their life. And there is an anti-food system bias. But I would say, if you want to just to give you a couple of very casual examples, about 20% of the fish that are caught on any given day are thrown overboard because they're not the fish that the ship went out to get. It's called the bycatch. That's just built right into the fishery. I believe that all the livestock that are raised on wheat, soybean, and corn are a product of food waste because those animals evolved to eat grass or insects, and instead they're required to eat something which they did not evolve to eat, and which is a very high energy crop because they have to get rid of it so it doesn't flood the market. So I believe that that form of raising livestock is a form of food waste. I think it's one form of waste to throw out coffee that you haven't drank, but it's an equal form of waste to throw out the coffee grounds. So they don't sort of go through the whole system of how waste is planned into the system from beginning to end, and to put all the emphasis on the consumer rather than the system or on government policy, in my opinion, it does a disservice to our understanding. I'll return to that at the end. My third point is that it's very important to have a wide concept of the food system. And it is true that a lot of food goes from your plate to the garbage can or to the landfill. But actually, landfill is only one of 3 places where food waste goes. The other, most obviously, is air. And agriculture and agriculture-related activities are the major production of global warming gases. When you don't look just at agriculture, but the entire food system, it is responsible for approximately a minimum of 1/3 and probably 1/2 of global warming emissions. And so that's a fair amount of impact on the airways. And our food system is very much biased towards annual plants rather than deep-rooted grasses or forest products. And again, that has a toll on the amount of carbon dioxide that gets stored on earthly systems and not in the atmosphere. So air is a big issue, and water, I believe, is the most important. So according to the latest estimate that just came out a month ago from a scientific journal, there are 5 trillion pieces of plastic waste in the oceans of the world, and they weigh 250,000 tons. And so that's plastic bags, plastic bits of this. About 1/3 of that is from food. And so they've left out packaging as part of the food waste, and they left out the waterways as a place that receives it. So in other words, we're talking about a much bigger and more expensive issue in terms of humans than they allow. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, food waste costs the world $427 billion a year to deal with. In Canada, that figure is $31 billion. But that's before when we're just counting getting it into landfill. The new estimates that just came out from the World Bank is that the cost of putting sewage in waterways and not treating it, which is actually the end of the food system, right, is $260 billion in disease costs that are related to it. So we're talking, we could fairly quickly get it up to $1 trillion is the cost that we're paying for food waste related issues, or that we could save if we handled it right. So this gets me to my last issue, which is how can we move forward from this excellent movie and get things happening. One of the other things that makes food unique, and I think why a lot of people are attracted to it, is that it requires action on a minimum of 3 levels. That is, there has to be individual engagement. You cannot, I'm not aware of any policy that can solve food problems without individuals being on side with it and doing their part. So there's an individual, personal element to it. There is a group element or a community element, and there is a government element. And I believe that what makes food very challenging for governments to understand is that it does work at those 3 levels. And governments don't feel comfortable when their level is not the only one that's calling all the shots, so they have a hard time feeling comfortable with food issues. But if we want to talk about personal, I would say the ones that come first to my mind are more soup, because soup was my mom's way of dealing with stuff that she didn't know what to do with, and the carrots were starting to get dry. Stew, same thing, and shepherd's pie, same thing. Okay, so we need to get back to those old food habits which have existed from time immemorial, because they were designed to solve a problem of not wasting food, right? I would say one of the ones that came out of the movie I thought was a very good one, which is to shop at farmers markets, because the oldest, it's going to be 1 day from having been picked. And at the newest, if it's an organic, fast-trucked lettuce from California, it's 3 days before it's got here. So you've got a minimum of 3 days edge in dealing with it when you buy it from a farmer's market, and it'll pay you back for any extra cost. And the last one is to shop after dinner, not before. So I happen to be old enough that when the whole family would, cars were so new, you would go for a Sunday drive, if you can imagine. Let's go to the traffic jam, family, and see what it's like to have some fun. And on Thursday night, we would all go shopping after dinner. And you shopped with a list, which wasn't hard to do because you just ate. And so your impulse buying is at its lowest, right? And so those are some personal things that people can do. At the group level, I believe that composting is best done at the community level. In the school that our daughter went to, we organized this Casseroles Are Us kind of program where everybody took one turn every 5th day to do a casserole, because cooking some things for 5 people is not a heck of a lot more work than cooking it for one family, and you do it in casserole, so you get rid of all the packaging waste, and you have a more nutritious meal, and you have sort of a more community binding event. There's litterless lunches that are now being promoted at schools, and I think universities have taken a real lead across Canada. University of Toronto, for example, has the biggest local and sustainable food purchasing program in the world. Okay, it's 90,000 students there, so whatever they have is going to be pretty significant. And and I think Trent is moving in the same direction, and across the country, across the Western world, really, universities are taking a lead in moving the food agenda. So there's things you could do at the group or institutional level. And at the government level, I believe that municipalities, they're the ones stuck with that bill for $31 billion, by the way. The federal government and the provincial governments may pass the laws, but the city is stuck with the bill. And so this is, in my opinion, an issue of food sovereignty. Like, if we're not making the decisions, how come we got to pay the $31 billion? So it's time for politicians in cities to get a little bit angry about the taxes you're paying for $31 billion to put waste and create global warming emissions with it. So the first place I would say is that they have to have tipping fees. And my favorite place to start would be the K-cups and coffees that Nestle and others have. And the trick of tipping fees is you don't want to collect them. You want the fee to be so high that no one in their right mind will tip there. They'll do the right thing instead. So that's the ideal tipping fee, just a little bit more than what it costs to do the right thing. And that's one thing that governments can do, is set a tipping fee at that level. And the second thing they can do is to incubate companies that are small and neighborhood and community-based companies that can do the right thing, that can do community composting. If we're paying to put stuff in landfill, why are we not paying somebody to compost it at the community level? So, and the biggest cheese maker in Britain is powered entirely by biogas from the cows. Okay, so there's a lot of methane coming out of the back end of a cow. And you can direct that, and it's quite a flop. But so there's whole ways of using animal manure as a fuel that is taking the biogas from it, and that's a form of food waste, I believe. The gray water from our houses, which is often filled with all sorts of little bits of food particles, when it goes into the waterway, causes grave harm because the water has to mobilize all the oxygen to try to break it down. But in your garden, it's a great boon. And you could easily set up plumbing systems where the hot water is stored in your home during the winter time until it's given off its heat to heat the house. And then it's let out into a small greenhouse or a garden where it's letting out the warm water and letting out all the nutrients that are in your gray water. So there are all sorts of things that cities can do in their core infrastructure. They give free rain barrels because it's cheaper than widening the sewage system, and it's also cheaper to do what I've just described than it is to widen the sewage system. And they can also require green roofs on all buildings over a certain size. And what happens in a typical healthy green roof is that the food businesses in the bottom take their compost up to the roof and they buy their fresh herbs and greens from the roof. So these are the kinds of systems that I think a modern city can develop, and I can't think of a better place to move to grass-fed beef, green roofs, and the whole kit and caboodle than Peterborough. Thank you very much.
Questions, if anyone wants to ask Wayne a question.
Well, as I say, I think the concept of a tipping fee is not to raise revenue for the city, which has been the traditional purpose of a tipping fee. The purpose of a tipping fee is to encourage people not to bring it to the landfill. So what you would need to do is a baseline study and find out what would happen in a high-rise or a shopping mall where you took one parking spot and put worm composting in there. What would it cost in a situation like that to properly deal with the food and compost it? And you'd add $25 out of the tipping fee. So in other words, it will vary from time to time because it's serving a principle. It's not a revenue raising, it's a money saving device. Correct. Yes, I think you'd probably put out a request for proposals for companies to do 20 kinds of things that you can do to keep food, keep waste plastic, etc., out of the system, find out what that baseline is, and then you add 20%. That would be my sense of how to do it. And you would have to balance that, of course, with what it actually costs you to maintain a landfill. But the fundamental purpose is to discourage anyone in their right mind from using it.
Okay, we got a question at the top here.
How effective are the green bin programs in Toronto, and how does Peterborough get one?
How effective is the green bin in Toronto, and how does Peterborough get one? I would say I would be interesting and nice if you could go beyond the green bin in Toronto. The concept of the green bin comes from a works department a philosophy, which as the senior manager once told me when we were lobbying against it, he said, "Wayne, I actually don't give a fuck what happens to the garbage after it gets into our trucks." So that's pretty well it. So, so if your idea of a food system is that it is a circular system and we're trying to go cradle to cradle, the food waste issue is resolved when food goes back into compost, goes back into the soil. And you can't have that. You know, the principle of garbage is that it's only garbage when you mix it all together. And then you can't get at the resource because you have to pay too much to separate them. And so when you put old socks, underpants, anything made of cotton, baby diapers with plastic on the outside, which might have poop in it and everything else, which might have disease issues, you throw all of that in with food scraps, you've just made a product that is worth nothing. Okay, so you should, I believe, separate the organics into food and into a non-food and put them in separate streams. The only reason why they value the organic thing is that it's designed to get the biogas that's in an organic material as it rots. But I believe the focus of a holistic system has to be to get that back into the soil. You know, back in the mid-1800s, all deep social thinkers, the most famous of whom was Karl Marx, talked about what was called the metabolic rift. What happens in society when you take all the nutrients out of the countryside and they all go to the city and are pooped into the city and go into the ocean? There is a total disbalance. And so that's a metabolic rift which we need to heal, and you heal it by, I believe, focusing on near urban agriculture and urban agriculture and having a circular system. And so what Toronto calls the green bin system, I believe, doesn't do that. It's one step to it, but it would be nice to see somebody model the full step and put that extra step involved, which is separate out organics, which are clean, and those which are loaded with dyes and ties and clothes and all that kind of stuff in another section altogether. The question is, are there any countries that are doing a good job on this? I think many areas are further ahead of Canada, and in Britain they're much further ahead, or in the European Union, they're much further ahead. In Germany, they're much further ahead, especially on packaging. So you can't have a package unless it can be recycled, for example. But nobody's got the whole system, because I think the whole issue with the metabolic rift, nobody can deal with it. But the interesting thing is that in December, as a result of satellite technology, scientists were finally able to document what I think is going to be one of the most important food trends of the century, which is in 2007, for the first time in world history, a majority of people lived in the city. And in 2014, for the first time in world history, the majority of farms were within cities or within 20 kilometers of cities. That is, the world is moving to urban agriculture and near urban agriculture. So we now live in a situation where we can resolve the metabolic rift in a rational and efficient way. And so that's how our so-called waste systems, or rather recovery systems, have to be oriented.
What do you think is the connection between the current food system and global wealth inequality, and what do you suggest can be done about that on an international macro level?
That's the easiest question of the night. What do I think about world inequality and how can that be addressed in terms of waste? And I think it is important. I don't know if people ever read the book by Veblen on conspicuous consumption, which was in the olden days, the wealthy had lawns and the working people grew food, and it was a status symbol that you had a lawn, because a lawn showed that you were so wealthy you didn't ever have to grow your own food, right? And everything about society was framed on that, is that if you were wealthy, you could sail, because now we had mechanical methods of going through the water, and since nobody spoke Latin, you could make it compulsory to study Latin at university. And so all sorts of stuff around food got based around that. I'm going to show you that I can afford to waste. So for example, the reason why Mexico got totally destroyed in terms of their meat industry as a result of the North American Free Trade Agreement is that they weren't aware of one of the clauses that they signed on chicken trade. And basically, as a result of the North American Free Trade Agreement, all chicken breasts that are made in the United States are sold in the United States, and all brown meat is sold into Mexico for pennies per pound, and totally destroyed the chicken industry. So it just shows you the measure of the prejudice in a wealthy society against eating anything but the prize parts. And many of you may know of the story of Winston Churchill when he came to the United States to give the beginning of the Cold War speech on the Iron Curtain, where that term was first formulated. And the day before, he was invited to a dinner by a woman who was his hostess, and he was asked what kind of meat he wanted, and he said he would have the breast. And then afterwards, his hostess said to him, "Sir Winston, please do not refer to it as breast. It is white meat." And so the next night, as he was going in to the American legislature and asked her to join him, and he said, "And I would be very honored if you would wear this corsage on your white meat." So there's all these prejudices about certain body parts, and we probably throw out half of the animals. And now it's quite a new trend in the food movement, is what's called nose-to-tail butchering. And all the better restaurants and more sustainably oriented restaurants are doing that. So the first thing is that the wealthy show off their wealth by wasting. And then the poor, when they get enough money, like when working people could afford a home in the 1950s, they imitated them. They never smoked cigarettes very much before then, and they imitated them on that, and they imitated them on lawns and the like. So that whole thing of showing status is very, in my opinion, fundamental to food waste. Some of you may have even remember going to parties where they would cut the crust off and all those kinds of things, so that you would not show that you were hungry, and you had to leave something on the plate so people wouldn't have thought you came to the meal hungry. And so status anxiety, all of those things are all a big, big part of what it's about. And and much of that is shown around rice. For example, rice, which is one of the major crops in the world, is almost entirely eaten as white rice, which is to say it's been deprived totally of its nutrients, as just a colonial imitation of the way the aristocracy of Europe ate their rice, which was milled. So all of these things play into it. Okay, so there is a party And no wasting. Drink it all.